Uh, as Alison said, I'm Az Hakeem. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I was always interested and intrigued by gender dysphoria, and um, I was also concerned that the world of psychiatry didn't seem to be thinking much about the minds of people with gender confusion, which going silent. So when I was a specialist registrar at the Portman Clinic, part of the Portman and Tavistock and Portman, I was given carte blanche really to do what I wanted. And it was a clinic that specialized in forensic psychotherapy. So it was psychotherapy for people who normal psychotherapists wouldn't touch with a bar's pole. So it was usually conditions related to sex, gender, violence. And they let me start a specialist service for gender dysphoria. And I did the work both in an individual setting and a group setting. And I did that. I started that in 2000, and I did that until I left the NHS in 2013. And my understanding of gender dysphoria was totally informed by the patients, which was far more useful than the theoretical stuff that I'd read beforehand. Most of my work and most of my ideas you'll find in my book, shameless plug now, Detrans, when transition is not the solution, as well as Alison's got it. She's also got bookmarks in it, which I'm really impressed by. Um, and I go through everything that I've learned and understood about gender dysphoria and all things trans, and I debunk a lot of myths in that. I'm gender critical in that I'm critical of gender ideology. I think it's nonsense. I think it's fantasy, and I explain why in the book. Um, just as a bit of a background, as to how we find us. Well, when I started this work, everyone thought, "Why on earth are you doing this esoteric niche thing?" And people thought I was bonkers for having an interest in it. But then, fast forward 24 years, and it's all the rage. Yeah, so I'm the only consultant psychiatrist in the country that specializes in the psychotherapy for gender dysphoria. So it can't be that interesting. Otherwise, more people will do it. so, so you know, just to put in context the whole trans thing. I mean, as many of you are aware, and some of you may not be aware, Stonewall was started off championing the rights of gay and lesbian people, and then when they achieved um, gay marriage in the UK, they had a meeting. The founders had a meeting, and they said, "Well, we've achieved everything we want to achieve. We've got two choices. We can either pat ourselves on the back and call it a day, or we can find a new cause." So they decided they were going to find a new cause, and that new cause was promoting gender ideology. And that's when the T was added to LGB. And it piggybacked on all the hard work that LGB rights had done by just sneakily adding a T. They didn't tell everyone that they were changing their cause. And one of the reasons why they continued was because they had so much money and backing. And that's how, via stealth, the T got introduced into society as this thing that we should accept in the same way we should accept gay, lesbians, and bisexual people. And that was really the beginning of the snowballing of trans. Because before then, trans was different things. So trans, as we refer to now, incorporates what we used to call transsexual, what we used to call transvestites. And in my first book and in my book here, I describe 11 different subtypes of transvestites, which is basically cross-dressers, and autogynephiles. There's always been far, far more transvestites than transsexuals. So most biological males who identify as trans are actually transvestites. Most of them have a penis, and most of them don't even want to get rid of their penis. They don't identify as women. They like temporarily occupying the vestiges of what they believe womanhood is and get variable degrees of enjoyment or excitement or sexual excitement from it. So it's more of a fetish. But by calling everyone trans, it rather unhelpfully, perhaps intentionally, makes us believe that all these people are transsexual. So that's a bit of a misunderstanding. So the problem with when people talk about trans, they believe that all these people are men who believe they should be women, or vice versa. Whereas the vast majority are cross-dressers. They don't believe that they're women or men. They just like impersonating them. So that's when the problems of self-ID come in. Because if you've got someone who can just self-identify as trans, you're by definition allowing most of them who are transvestites, a large proportion of fetishistic transvestites who get sexually excited with a penis, to occupy women's spaces. And you don't have to be a genius to realize that that's not a great idea. And the famous Helen Stanland question of would you be happy for your 9-year-old daughter to be alone in a changing room with a biologically intact male is relevant. But unfortunately, many people, including the SNP and I think the Liberal Democrats, would oppose that idea and say that, oh no, of course these are women, they should be in women's spaces. So that's what we're up against. Those of you who don't know what autogynephilia is, it's a sexuality. So it's a thing that turns the men on who have it, of the fantasy of having female bodily parts. So they don't believe they're women, and they're not cross-dressers, or they can cross-dress. Their sexual fantasy is of having female bodily parts, and they're quite rare. You don't come across many of those. And so the vast majority are transvestite, of which a proportion are fetishistic. They get sexually turned on, excited by it. Some are transsexual, and a small proportion are autogynephiles. So one of the strange things I found out was to get a UK driving license changed from male to female. I think the requirements are you only have to cross dress as a woman twice a month. So you don't even have to self-identify as a woman. You just have to cross dress. So you can have all these legal documents that can say that you're a woman just by impersonating one a couple of times a month. And the birth certificate, I mean, I was the only opposition in Hansard when that came around, the Gender Recognition Act. The birth certificate is a historical document of what happened in time. So even if in some fantasy scenario you could change from a man to a woman or a woman to a man, that doesn't change what you were born as. But we're now living in an age where your birth certificate can be changed, which says that you were never born a man or woman, that you were always born this thing that you changed to on your 100th birthday. So fantasy is really taking over reality. Um, I'm a scientist. I believe in biology. I believe in science. What I don't believe in is that feelings and fantasy can trump biology and science. But the strange thing is that we find ourselves in this Orwellian 1984 society where um, all the major medical organizations, the GMC, the BMA, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Medicine, um, they all have been taken over by gender ideology. And I teach medical students at UCL, and I say to them, I'm pointing to some young, white, blonde, 20-year-old medical students, and I say, if she believed that she was an elderly male black Nigerian, would she be? Just to make it ridiculous. And they say, yes, she would be if she believed it. And I thought, what? And I give them a few more examples, and they all say, oh yes, if they believe they are, then they are. And I said, how did you get here? You got here with your science A levels. You meant to believe in science. How on earth can you believe that? And by the end of the lecture, they say, oh, we didn't know you were allowed to think like that. So they're giving up on what they really know to be true for this Orwellian, um, sort of two and two is five nonsense. And even in Scotland, there was this. I don't know whether I think they did pass it, didn't they? Where if one of your parents is gender critical and disputes gender ideology at the dining table, you can shop them to the police, which is exactly what the children in 1984 were doing in George Orwell's book, where they were shopping their parents into the police for not going along with the whole nonsense that was going on in 1984. There's a chapter in the book where I liken gender ideology and where we are now to 1984, because I reread 1984 a couple of years ago and I thought, oh my God, this is exactly where we're at now. So what I found when I was doing my service, my therapy service, was that the one-on-one therapy situation was quite unhelpful because it was a very black and white mind that they had. So it was very right, wrong, yes, no, male, female. And what you find in the individual situation is this dyadic bind where you find yourself in a pantomime, which is almost like yes, no, no, you are, yes, you are. What I found much more helpful was to run exploratory groups. So, and I'm a group analyst. I was trained as one at the time, but I was a trainee. But I trained as a group analyst. And an analytic group is one where the thoughtfulness, the analysis, is done by everyone in the group, not just by the smarty pants therapist. So I conduct it, but all the patients do the therapy. And that was far more powerful because I ran mixed groups of preoperative transsexuals, postoperative transsexuals who are regressors, detransitioners, transvestites, autogynephiles, all in groups of around 8 people. And all the challenges and all the what you're saying sounds like nonsense wasn't coming from me, it was coming from each other. And they all had a vested interest in gender. But they could identify with what the person was saying, but they could see objectively that it didn't make sense. And in the groups, the notion of what it was to be male or female or what on earth masculinity or femininity is was deconstructed. And all these notions that they took for granted were examined, challenged, deconstructed. And by after a while of being in the group, their understanding of their limited understanding of what it was to be male or female was completely revised. And what they started off with was, I'm not really the right sort of man or woman, therefore I should be the opposite. What they ended up was, actually, anything that I like or do is fine in the sex I am. So what I was trying to do was to encourage these people to be more subversive. What I realized was quite early on was that the biological males who are presenting as transsexual, 100% autism. They were all on the autistic spectrum. And the thing about being on the autistic spectrum is you have very black and white, concrete, rigid rules that you live by. You don't like change. You don't like things that don't fit in the rules. And they all have this sense of there's something not quite right about me, which is probably because they're autistic and they realize that there was something a bit different about them. And at some point, this there's something different about me latched onto the idea of maybe it's my gender. And then in the truly autistic way, they honed in on it, they focused on it, and then they became on a mission to change it. And as any of you will know that have had contact with people on the spectrum, if they don't get their way, they get very upset. And if you don't agree with them, you hate them. So that's why if you look at those videos of college students screaming at lecturers when they don't agree with their chosen gender, it's an adult version of autistic meltdown. The autistic meltdown we're familiar with the autistic child whose baked beans are touching the fish fingers and they have this massive screaming row. That's the equivalent as an adult. And as for pronouns, you know how pronouns have become the most important piece of grammar now. Nobody knew what a pronoun was before. But when the reason why, I explain this in the book as well, the reason why people are so het up on pronouns is that the autistic mindset, the core deficit of the autistic mind is that you don't have an awareness of what's happening in the other person's mind. It's called lack of theory of mind. So people who aren't on the spectrum, you can gauge how people are feeling or thinking by working it out by the micro data that you get. With autism, you don't have that. So you're relying on macro data where they're smiling, frowning, telling you that they're happy or telling you that they're not. So the autistic person, they don't really know what you're thinking or feeling. And the pronoun becomes evidence to them of what you really believe. So if I said, actually, I'm a woman, I want you all to call me she, her. And if you do that, I will then have the understanding that you really believe I'm a woman because you're saying she, her in relation to me, therefore you believe it. And if you slip up and get the pronoun wrong, that's evidence that you don't really believe it. So this almost legislating about pronouns is a way of trying to control your mind to make sure you believe that I am the sex I want you to believe I am. That's why they get so het up. It's not just a word, it's a proxy indicator for what you believe in relation to them. So I had a group once, the patient was saying that they went out cross-dressed to a restaurant and everyone believed that they were a woman. And I said, well, how on earth do you know that? He said, well, nobody said anything. I had long hair, I had a wig on, I had a dress on, lipstick, and nobody challenged it. And I said, well, how do you know what they were thinking? And they said, well, they didn't say anything. So the fact that in the absence of macro data, the presumption is they must believe I'm a woman. It's as simple as that. So that's why pronouns and having all this stuff, that means people really believe. And they can't even consider that people might secretly not believe that. And what I saw was so 26% of my patients were regretters. So they were convinced that they were the wrong sex. They had, let's call them sex changes. And then at some point they realized that it wasn't the solution and they regretted it. And what I came to understand is so they'd gone from gender dysphoria to transgender euphoria to transgender dysphoria. And what I seemed to notice was that the risk of regretting depended on how autistic they were. If they were really autistic and they had no idea that nobody else didn't believe that they were the new sex because they weren't overtly telling them, then they were fine. They went through life merrily thinking that everyone believed that they were the other sex. If they were less autistic, they then had this sense of feel a bit of a fraud. And then they questioned whether other people really did buy into it. And that's when they regretted it. That's the biological males. The biological females, of which there's a massive big ascendancy now of females that believe that they're men, rather than being autistic, a lot of them were autistic, but there was a huge amount of internalized lesbophobia, either from themselves or their family or their culture they're in. There was this unacceptability about being a lesbian, and there was a lot of trauma as well, often sexual trauma. So if the male transsexuals, it was 100% autism. For the females, it was a combination of possibly autism, possibly sexual trauma, possibly internalized homophobia. For the transvestites, they weren't autistic. The transvestites had a had a sexuality. Surprisingly, or maybe surprisingly, the transsexuals weren't that sexual because the more autistic you are, the less interested you are in sexual stuff. The really autistic was this dirty, disgusting thing. They didn't understand why anybody would want to have sex. And if you if you have a sexuality, then behaving in a way that doesn't correspond with your sexuality is aversive. So, gay people don't want to have heterosexual sex, and heterosexuals don't want to have gay sex. Bisexuals don't mind. But if you don't have a sexuality, if you're like colorblind, then you can go through the mechanics with neither excitement or revulsion. So when you see people saying, "Oh yes, well I used to fancy men, but now I fancy women because of my sex change," that's nonsense. They've just they've either always been bisexual or they don't have a sexuality. They can go through the mechanics. So the transvestites, they do have a sexuality, so they're turned on by getting inside the external appearance of the opposite sex. And one of my predecessors at the Pullman Clinic Mervyn Glasser wrote this paper, this analytic paper in 1977 called "Analysis of the Fetishistic Transvestite," and what he described is how um, a man with a history of a smothering, suffocating, overpowering mother later in life finds that by putting on their mother and taking off their mother, having the control over putting her on and taking her off, afforded them a great sense of power over the original trauma of being suffocated by this mother who he couldn't get off him. So there was this, as with all perversions, there was a triumph over what was originally a trauma. And I certainly did see that in a number of my transvestites. And they would all turn up looking a bit like Hyacinth Bouquet, like the sort of the middle-aged sort of Rotary attending um, woman from Surrey or something. I hope I'm not offending anyone here who fits that description. Um, but there was definitely a sense of power and confidence that they had by putting on their mother and taking their mother off at will. That doesn't go to say that's for all transvestites, but that was definitely a subgroup. So his hypothesis was based on a very small number he saw, but it definitely was an example. But there's loads of other reasons. But it's all they all have in common this idea of something exciting about being inside in disguise or impersonating a woman. And then and the thing I teach my medical students is the difference between a transsexual, a transvestite, and a drag queen. And there's a big difference. The transsexual wants to be the other sex. The transvestite doesn't want to be the other sex, but they want to impersonate or temporarily reside in the opposite sex. And both of those are slavishly adhering to what they believe the gender rules are in society. The drag queen isn't. The drag queen is actually more advanced. And it's one of the things that I do agree with Judith Butler, although she changes her mind every time she writes something. And she talked about how the drag queen is ridiculing the gender framework. So the point of a drag queen is they don't want to pass or look like a woman. And they're not parodying women, they're parodying what we understand as gender frameworks. So they have big hair, high heels, makeup, and they're sort of saying, I'm following all these rules that you have that you understand as gender, but I'm showing you how ridiculous it is, which shouldn't be confused with ridiculing women. That's the big mistake people make. They think they're ridiculing them. They're not. They're ridiculing the notions of gender. So every society has their own notions of what it is to be masculine and feminine. In some countries, it's feminine to have lots of metal rings on your neck or a big tongue plate or whatever it is. In our society, it's feminine to have long hair, makeup, and whatever it is. So they're parodying the gender framework, not women. And they're saying how ridiculous this notion is of gender that you seem so constrained by. So whereas the autistic person cannot fathom subverting rules, the transvestite is sneakily impersonating. The drag queen is ridiculing the framework by which lots of people feel constrained. And I talk to my patients about the spectrum between gender confident and gender underconfident. So the gender underconfident person will be like the autistic transsexual who believes that because they're not this typical caricature of a man or a woman, that they have to then switch to plan B, which is the opposite sex. The gender confident person will say, well, yeah, I like wearing dresses or makeup or whatever it is and lipstick, but I'm doing that as a man. I could, or the tomboy or the whatever it is. They're not pretending they're another sex. They're subverting frameworks. And I was trying to encourage that in my patients. I was saying, well, fine, what is it that you want to do or be about being a woman or a man? And they'd come up with all these things. And I'd say, well, just do that anyway. Why do you have to change your sex? Just do it. If you want to do that, do that. And you think of people like Nicky Wire and Manic Street Preachers. He was never pretending to be a woman, but he was subverting frameworks. And that's fine. I'm all for subversion. I mean, I used to be a goth, and if you look at photos of me when I was a teenager and all my friends, we looked like transvestites, but we weren't trying to be. We just being goths. Had more makeup than most women wear normally. I mean, my favorite question of my mother was, "Are all the boys wearing red lipstick at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?" I love the specifics of the question, not why wearing lipstick, but red lipstick, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Um, so yeah, so autism for the transsexual males, trauma, internal homophobia, and a bit of autism in the females, not in the transvestites, and the large proportion of trans people are transvestites. That's a fetish, and the autogynephiles is a fetishistic sexuality. Um, so psychotherapy. So I'm often accused of being a transphobe or a conversion therapy practitioner. I mean, I doubt I'm a transphobe because I wouldn't dedicate such a large proportion of my career to thinking about researching, writing, and trying to help them if I was phobic. A bit like my patients who have psychosis and schizophrenia, whatever it is. I just because I think they're psychotic, it doesn't mean I hate them. It's just a ridiculous argument, So I like my patients, and I may consider them to have psychosis or delusion or whatever it is, but that doesn't mean I hate them. So in psychiatry, we know that we don't just affirm people. If we affirmed anorexics, we'll be helping them lose weight. The anorexic really believes that they need to lose more weight. If you affirmed them and helped them, you'd be a pretty rubbish doctor. The really severely depressed patient can believe at times that they need to end their life. If you affirmed them, you wouldn't be a very good doctor either, but we know not to do that. We know that our task is to try and help them understand as to how they got there and think with them as to other possible, ways. So when someone says, I think I'm in the wrong body, why on earth are we going along with it? Because when they say, well, I feel like I'm a woman, well, no, you don't, because you've never been a woman. I mean, how do you, it's not a feeling state. Feeling states are happy, sad, irritated, overjoyed, all those emotions. Being a man or a woman isn't a feeling state. You could say, oh, I feel like it should be Friday. That doesn't mean it is Friday. That just means it's an idea that you've got. It's not a feeling, it's an idea that you've got. And we need to separate ideas from feelings, just as we need to separate fantasy from reality. But in this new post-truth age, no one seems to know the basic differences between fantasy, reality, feelings, and ideas. So there's no such thing as feeling like a woman or feeling like a man. If you're a biological man, anything you feel is your feelings, and they must be male because you're male, vice versa for females. So when someone goes to their clinician and says, I feel like I'm a woman, weirdly, the doctor or the clinician, the psychologist never says why. I said why. The whole basis of my therapy that I provided was asking why. It wasn't about saying, no, you're not. It wasn't about saying, don't do this, don't do this, do that. Because I was working with adults. If I was working with children, maybe I would have done, but I was working with adults. So, anything an adult does, it's up to them. You can get a tattoo of a cobweb on your face. So it's up to you. I don't think it's a good idea, but I wouldn't stop you. So it was merely me asking why, how'd you get to there? How help me understand? And it reminded me a bit like me with my maths A level, which I was dire. And you get tricked after GCSE into doing maths, which involved numbers, into doing maths A level, where the numbers are disappearing, it's all letters and squiggles, and I didn't have any understanding. And I used to try and sequentially, simplify complex equations and then make one error and end up over there rather than over there. And that's what happened with I was trying to understand with someone who believed that they're the wrong sex, how they got there. And often they'd come to this conclusion as a child, and they'd never revisited their thought processes. And then they're in front of me as an adult, and I'm trying to get them to go through their thought process, and they've just made one sequential error, and they've ended up in the wrong conclusion. And by in the therapy and by being in the group, their their processing of the original problem, which wasn't gender, is explored. And my belief is that the transsexual solution is a false solution to a different problem or problems. I would say there's no such thing as transsexuality, and there's no such thing as a trans child, especially because it's like I said, it's a false solution. It's people aren't born in the wrong body. No bodies are wrong. If you're not happy with your body, then let's try and help think with you as to why you're not happy with your body. If you don't like being a particular sex, then why? What is it about being a particular sex? So that's the work that needs to be done, not affirming, going along and colluding with a false notion. But to say that is considered transphobic. Well, I'll let you decide. But so I've never ever given hormones or the sign off for surgery. And I never wanted to be in a position of doing that. So I've always made sure that I work on the outside of a gender clinic. So whilst everyone knows the Tavistock as the GIDS service, when I was at Tavistock, it was a tiny little mole that then grew over the next 20 years to being this massive tumor that took over the whole establishment. Most of the Tavistock are gender critical, but the Tavistock is the child and family department, the adolescent department, the adult department, the masses. GIDS was a three people in a cupboard when I was there, but the number of referrals and the money generated to the Tavistock by GIDS was, while psychotherapy was going down, GIDS was exploding, and it just took over. So it's slightly unfortunate that everyone just thinks of the Tavistock as synonymous with the GIDS service. Um, where I was, the Pullman Clinic was extremely gender critical, so they were very supportive of my work. Um, I haven't worked there since 2013, so I don't know what the situation is there now. So am I offering conversion therapy? No, I offer explore. Well, I don't offer any now because it's so politically dangerous that I've stopped working with gender people. I do, like my PA said, why can't you just treat nice people like you're depressed, bipolar, anxious, PTSD people? So I thought, yeah, right, actually. So rather than getting myself sort of, like a attempted to be murdered by the trans activists. So now I concentrate my gender work on parents, organizations, talking to people like you lot, teaching, um, and that's far more useful, and writing about it. Because, I did that work for 2 decades without anybody knowing what I did. I wrote academic papers which nobody reads, not my mother read them. And but as soon as you write a book or give talks or give interviews and podcasts, then people get the message. And once you talk to people as a normal, rational, sensible person based in science that doesn't hate anyone, that just wants everyone to be happy, then people realize you're not phobic, you don't hate them, you're just having a normal, balanced approach to it. So I don't know anyone that's met me that thinks that I'm transphobic. They might think that before they've met me because of what they've heard. But then once you talk to them, they realize you're just being sensible. And I was talking to someone yesterday. I met someone for the first time, and I was talking to them, and they had all these presumptions about, um, you know, famous gender critical people, and then after about an hour of talking to them, they could see it for what it was. They started off believing that, there were such things as trans kids and this and the other. By the end of it, they realized, oh my God, they've got it completely wrong. And that, no, we shouldn't be castrating children because they're confused. I mean, the children thing is the biggest medical scandal of our time. It's worse than lobotomies because there was actually more evidence for lobotomies, and lobotomies were done in adults. The idea that a child can be labeled as trans in the first 5 years of their life is scandalous. And then to put child on what we call in a very sanitized way puberty blockers, which are actually chemical castration agents, is criminal. We go and watch films about Alan Turing and say, oh, how awful it was that he was given chemical castration because he was gay in the war. But yet we have no problem giving chemical castration, the exact same medicine, to children. And children can't consent. They haven't got the mental capacity. They can't vote. They can't smoke. They can't drink. They can't possibly give informed consent to an intervention that will probably render them impossible to have a sexual orgasm as an adult and be infertile. Hopefully a 12-year-old child hasn't had a sexual orgasm. So how on earth can they consent to never having one? It's preposterous that adults are willing to do this to children. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the WPATH guidelines, but WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, They were and are believed erroneously by the medical world to be a group of scientists doing evidence-based research to come up with guidelines on how to treat gender, and they're accepted worldwide. Um, but as some of you know, there was a leak recently, and to join WPATH, you don't have to be a doctor or a psychologist. You can be anyone. So it's mainly trans activists. And in their eighth version of standards of care, their guidelines that came out last year, they not only did they get rid of the ethics section, but they had a new section, a new diagnosis. And the new diagnosis was eunuch gender. And the guidelines said that children could be diagnosed as having eunuch gender from any age without any lower age limit. So you could diagnose a 1-year-old as being a eunuch, eunuch identified. And their recommendation of treatment was chemical and physical castration. So you have a worldwide body that's recommending that infants and children are castrated because they probably identify as eunuchs. And if you look at the sources of information, the references for how they came to this, there's nothing scientific. The references are the eunuch archives. The eunuch archives are written pornography depicting the forced castration of boys against their will. That is the source of reference. And without scrutiny, these WPATH guidelines are taken as gospel by every medical body around the world. And that forms the basis of treatment guidelines by your beloved NHS, who still refer to WPATH guidelines. So, you know, if you go to the NHS website and you're looking up gender dysphoria, it'll just talk about hormones and surgery, nothing about exploratory therapy, just about affirmation, just about hormones, and just about surgery. But it's absolutely not. And there's a growing bunch of us who are openly skeptical. Some people are hiding behind, you know, sort of, I'm not, I never have. I don't mind getting, you know, death threats and stuff. And but I'm used to it. I've been doing it for 24 years. But I'm lucky I'm self-employed. And when I have been employed, my employers have always been supportive of my position. But anyway, I'm going to stop blathering on because I think I've done 40 minutes, which I said I'd do. But I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope I haven't put you off your dinner.
No, that's great, Az. Thanks very much. It's a really interesting talk you've given us. We've got loads of questions, but I'm going to kick off with one that came in this afternoon by email. I'd like to know if Az is in a position to freely state if he thinks gender dysphoria is a real thing, or if there are always other issues and it's used as an escape route.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's a non-problem. It's a false solution to a, I won't say a non-problem, to different problems. And the problem may be internalized homophobia, it may be previous sexual trauma, it may be identity crisis within autism. There's always something else. And it's the erroneous solution. And because we give it a name, then people believe it exists. And you know, you create a thing and you create a diagnosis and people will have it. That's my understanding. Yeah.
It's very much three men in a boat, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you deal with these in each of your chapters.
Of course. There's this future heirloom that you can pass on to generations. Um, uh, Essential reading, especially if you've got like a sort of gender critical bookshelf, is not complete without this. And it's the only gender critical book written by a doctor. Okay.
Right? No, there's another one. Last
Oh, there's
Happy.
another one. Yes, another one.
Yeah,
It's the only British gender
okay.
critical book written by a doctor.
Yeah, well, it's really good. Okay, I'm going to ask Nicola now to ask her question. Nicola, you came to the Lost Boys screening. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Hello, Dr. Hakeem. I asked you actually a question, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, and it was one of those things. And I asked the question about this gender and clothing, the non-conformity. And it was a small point, yet it's such a diffuse kind of cultural area. And you used terminology that I literally didn't like remember. And I'm harassing you for what the terminology was that you used, which it was so useful and I didn't write it down. Do you mind repeating it?
Well, I know what I'll say. My answer is I don't know what exact words I used, but so at the Portman Clinic, they even though they were a clinic who were treating paedophiles, rapists, and murderers, they were up in arms that their waiting room was full of men in dresses, and they said, "How on earth can you let men in women's clothes sit in the change in the waiting room?" And and I said, well, the problem is that your problem is similar to the patient's problem in that you're highly invested in believing that these clothes are to do with a certain sex. They're not. They're just clothes. You believe they're women's clothes. The person wearing them believes they're women's clothes. They're not. They're just clothes. So if I wear a dress, I'm not trying to be a woman. I'm just subverting your framework and saying, look, think again. I'm still a man. I'm wearing what you think is a woman's clothing. Clothes are clothes. They have no meaning. They only have a meaning that you were forged to them. And so I'm all for ungendering clothing. And it's more important dealing with what's in the person's mind that they associate with that clothing and the meaning they afford to it than the clothing. Clothing's just fabric. You know, is a t-shirt women's clothing because they bought it in a women's shop or men's shop? No, it's just a shirt. So you deconstruct the psychological associations with that clothing.
It was ungendering clothing. Thank you so very much indeed. I'm not going to steal that and kind of write that somewhere or anything like that. It was just
You
one of
can.
those useful frames of reference. Thank you so much. For me, the most progressive thing would be to say, I am a man and I'm in a dress. Okay.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to go into a women's
But they
space.
do that in Scotland. They call them kilts.
Exactly. Press on. They do it around the world.
They've just been
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, and now I've got another question, but somebody wants me to ask this for them. Um, the question is this: second wave feminists were clear that gender and femininity was a social construct of patriarchy, which was created by men to control our women's behavior.
a complicated question.
Okay, but I'm coming to it now. Men identifying as women is this cosplaying using the construct, and is it nothing to do with actually being a woman?
I don't think it's to do with being a woman. No, that's why it's so autistic because they have these criteria for what a woman is. Like women are this, and this. So if I do this, and this, like a recipe, and therefore I will be a woman. It's totally autistic. It's like, and whenever I ask them, well, what is a woman? They say, oh, women have long hair. They have the nice feelings. It's like, hang on a minute. It's like this ridiculous, deconstruction of. So the autistic mind is very much into constructs and rules, and you can't break down what a man or a woman is apart from chromosomes and bodies. So it's so for the transsexual, it is an autistic way of understanding what a man or woman is. For the transvestite, it is a exciting impersonation. That's the best answer I can give you.
Okay. You've got any other comment on that question?
Me?
No, our asker.
Oh, I see.
See, maybe you'll come back to us. But in between that, then I'll ask Una Jane to pass her comment that she made early on.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself and then
Yep.
searching through. I made a comment. You were very self-deprecating, saying that the psychotherapy wasn't valuable. No, I think it's extremely valuable. I think that other psychiatrists are just terrified of the deluded, gender-confused men, and most psychiatrists initially wanted nothing to do with the.
Oh, they don't want anything to do with it. So I can say that I don't know a single psychiatrist, apart from a few captured ones, that aren't gender critical, but they daren't say anything and they want nothing to do with it because they know they get vilified and their careers ruined and their families attacked. And we are all aghast that the Royal College of Psychiatrists has a position statement on gender, which none of us agree with. And when a group of us had a meeting with the Royal College of Psychiatrists a few years ago, um, we were just talked over and said, well, this is, we believe the trans women and women. It was like the monologue, the captured Orwellian monologue we were given. And we said, look, we don't think it's that your actual members and fellows agree with your mission statement. Could you possibly survey your members a questionnaire we'd give you? And they refused. So, so it's a bit like this sort of totalitarian, this is what psychiatrists think, without any psychiatrists believing that.
When do we get back into reality?
But then, even more Orwellian, we then asked for the minutes of the meeting, and they said the meeting never happened. We're going, hang on, there's 5 of us there, there's 5 of you there, we all remember happening. Well, they said, no, this meeting never happened.
Wow, that is Orwellian.
This is a terrible, terrible problem. To have highly respected, highly trained medical.
I'm not sure how much we respect psychiatrists. I don't think psychiatrists.
Yeah, I know. I did speak with Dr. Alice Partial, who was the medical director for mental health services for Northwest London in 2008. And the first thing she said about this situation was, well, compared to physical medicine, psychiatry is in the Stone Age.
Oh, totally.
10 years, 15 years later, I entirely agree with her on that, but it has taken a lot of study to say that with some knowledge. But look, I mean, unless the Royal College of Psychiatrists wants to sign its professional death warrant, they're going to have to do something a little more sophisticated.
They haven't even made any nod towards the Cass report.
It's outrageous.
Yeah. I mean, they really have their head in sand, and they still brag about getting a silver Stonewall Diversity Champion Award, where the whole world is going, well, don't go anywhere near Stonewall. So I think they're like deaf and dumb and blind as far as they've got no insight.
Anyway, you're extremely brave, and I have thanked you, I think, on Twitter, and I'm doing the same now. Thank you.
Very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Now to Nigel. Nigel, you've got a question about numbers, percentages, I think.
Hello. No, I was interested in that you were saying there is a very low percentage of transsexuals who are AGP. Because from what I've read around, which is...
Well, they're different. They're different. Transsexuals aren't AGP and AGP aren't transsexuals.
Right, but the percentage of AGPs in this field, you say is pretty small. And I always thought that it was, from what I've read, it seems to people think it's pretty high. It's the main driver of it all.
No, so if you look at social media and Twitter and gender critical Twitter and social media, there's a confusion between fetishistic transvestites and AGP. So it's almost like people have forgotten the term transvestite, and they believe that if you're not transsexual, you're AGP, and they're using AGP when they mean fetishistic transvestite.
Okay.
So the man dressed up in some strange sort of like provocative women's clothing with a large erect penis is an AGP. They're fetishist transvestites.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you. Shall I ask my second question?
No, we'll come back to you. Oh, go on, I hear.
It's only short. It's what is your understanding of what non-binary means, and how anybody can make sense of what the concept is supposed to be?
So going back to me being a goth, so we've all, ever since the post-war, we've always had youth subculture, because post-war there was this we were allowed to have this intermediate transitional period between being a child and being an adult, where you question everything that your parents have told you is true, and then you're trying to work out for yourself, and you're subversive, and then you're a sensible adult, and you've come to your understanding of the world. And historically, it was always based in music. So whether you're a teddy boy, a rocker, a punk, a mod, or hippie, whatever it was music based, and that was understandable because your whole everything about you and your teenage hormone driven thing was invested in bands and music and the identities, and that's easy to understand. Then social media came along, and what happened was that Whereas before, the only medium we had was music bands and music press. Our medium now is far more interesting because you had social media, you had your Facebook profile, your MySpace, your whatever it was, and music from the advent of social media just became music. So kids are, yeah, they like music, but it's nowhere near as important as it was for Generation X and before. So your identity is now in your social media profile. So you're obsessed with how many likes you have and who's following you and all this sort of stuff. And the and in my book, I talk about the phases of post-punk goth. So there was punk, then there was goth Mark One, which is a bit like punk, which is me, and then there was goth Mark Two, which is a bit softer. Goth Mark Three, they discovered color and shoegazing. Goth Mark Four was emos, they started self-harming, and then social media comes around. Goth Mark Five are trans non-binary, and if you look at punks, goths, emos, and non-binary, they all look the same. They look like me. They look like me as I was 16 with my lipstick and my backcombed hair and my skinny trousers and my millions of rings or so on. So we all, the whole point of it was to challenge these things, and we all looked a bit asexual and a bit sort of effeminate and a bit. But so what? And I always say this when I was 15. My friend Jenny turned up at my nice, lovely, privileged North Wales boarding school, and she had backcombed hair and lipstick and eyeliner and eyeshadow, and she looked really cool. And we're going, "Oh my God, what are you?" And so I'm a goth. Within a month, we were all goth. There was an epidemic of goths, pandemic, or whatever. And now, someone like Jenny now in 2024 goes to school looking exactly the same as Jenny looked then. And someone goes, "What are you?" "I'm non-binary." The whole school's non-binary. So it's not that there's a pandemic of gender confusion. It's not like COVID. It's just kids being cool. So these kids who say I'm non-binary trans, they're just being goths. They're goth Mark Five. It's a subculture, but because it's not associated with music, we're not seeing it as a subculture. So, my parents had the right idea. They were saying, "Oh, it's a phase, ignore it. At least he's doing well in his A levels and hopefully he'll get into medical school." The right idea. And but now parents go, "Oh my God, they've got a medical condition. We better castrate them." Basically, that's the short version. But so if there was a goth identity clinic in 1986, then I would have been banging at the door of the goth identity clinic to have my eyebrows tattooed and my lips tattooed purple and my hair permanently backcombed. But luckily there wasn't. Whereas the kids' gender identity clinics are basically goth identity clinics now. And we are stupidly mistaking a youth subculture for a medical disorder.
What's interesting, the Liberal Democrat manifesto published today says that the party believes that non-binary should be have a legal category.
But they're just saying, most MPs, they're just saying what they think people want to hear. They don't believe that. They don't really believe people are non-binary. The only people who are non-binary are the very small proportion of people who are intersex. And intersex is what used to be called hermaphrodite, which is now called disorders of sexual development, where people are biologically neither wholly male or female. They're a very tiny proportion of the population. But, people who identify as non-binary don't tend to be intersex. And intersex people hate people jumping on their bandwagon because theirs is a proper thing which causes them problems, whereas non-binary is like a fashionable thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Lee, your turn next. You've got a question, I think.
Yeah. Hi, Az. Could you give a bit of information about your experience with what I would call confused women? Because obviously, understanding them maybe as transvestites and transsexuals, those sorts of labels or terms don't apply.
So, well, the thing is, the women can be transvestites without being transvestites because it's you can do the whole dressing in what you believe to be a very male thing and wearing suits all the time. That's fine. That you don't have to be given a label for that because it's acceptable. Whereas it's less so for men because it's more unusual. So yes, they can be transvestites, but they're not called that because it's acceptable within women's appearance. And what was the other thing? Transvestites and
transsexuals. I mean, I had read recently that there is a bit of a theory that women do have a sexual fetish interest, and that's why they wish to remove that's by the way they wish to have the addition of a penis and remove their breasts. I mean, I was thinking, is it more a rejection of womanhood, or being a girl? And that's how
So
I've read about it.
if you look at the population of women that I saw, and in those days it was 8-to-1 male to female racial biological male. Now it's like women are off the scale, and there's a number of things. So whereas I talked about autogynephilia, there's also autoandrophilia, but no one ever, people never references that. But that is the fetish of having a penis. But then you've also got, so I mean, I had a patient who culturally it was so awful being a woman that she hated the idea of being a woman, so she wants to become a non-woman, which is therefore male. I mean, maybe these days she'd have chosen non-binary, but some of them was an escape from the intolerability of being a woman for whatever reason, either because of society, how they treat them, or because their history of sexual abuse, and they wanted to get away from that version of themselves that was traumatized by the abuse. Others, it might be some autistic things. So, those sorts of reasons, but there's a lot of internalized homophobia. And there's a lot of people I saw who are very culturally or from a religious background who could not accept the idea of being gay. And so they had to literally transfer the gay away and become straight. And now when I talk to young females now, I say, so you're female and you like women, okay, so you must be a lesbian, right? And they go, oh no. I said, do you know any lesbians? No. Do you know any famous lesbians? No. Do you know any trans masculine people? Oh yes, and they list. So on social media, there's all these like examples of these muscly, masculine, hairy, bearded, trans masculine, and it's almost like the female to male trans masculine is lesbian Mark two. Lesbian Mark one is obsolete because who wants to be this lesbian? What's a lesbian? And I know what lesbian is. Whereas you could be this superhero man thing. So they go for option two. And they don't have to be gay, they can be straight, they can be big and muscly and bearded and strong and like the superhero version of a non-lesbian.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, no sense, but some sense.
Well, yes, to them. Yeah. And also with the autism, it would be straight one to the other if it's a high degree of autism.
Also, they're told at school that they can choose what gender they are. And I had an autistic patient who said, well, when I was at school, we were told that you can choose what gender you had to be. And it's like a careers teacher thing. And so I thought, well, women have these possibilities in life and men this. And then I don't like suits and I don't like short hair. And therefore, I thought I'd pursue being a woman like it was a careers choice. This is absurd. You've got to choose your genders. Now, we taught at school, they said you can choose your genders.
Yeah.
Could I just ask something quickly here? Because they're saying, well, that you're sort of defining it as sexuality. I mean, do any of them say, but I'm going to get a better job? How do they visualize themselves going into the work world if they're sort of making themselves into mini men? Do they ever talk about it in that way, as opposed to only this sexual?
So you separate the transsexuals from the transvestites. So the transsexuals have been missold the idea that they can really be the opposite sex. And they believe that they'll be fully accepted as legitimate members of the opposite sex. And, I saw these sort of screenshots of conversations by a female to male transsexual who had chopped her breasts off, but obviously had no penis and just and she was saying how horrified she was as a new gay man having turned up at a gay sex orgy and none of the men were interested in him. Sorry. And it's like, well, of course, because you don't have a penis. But they actually believe that they could be a man with a legitimate in every sense. And I talked to them and I said, but how do you think you're not going to have the genitals? And they're going, nobody cares these days. We don't care about that anymore. But they're so misinformed and unrealistic expectations. So that's the transsexuals. The transvestites, they just get turned on by the idea of getting into women's spaces, whether it's women's clothing, women's spaces, women's private things. And the more they can get in, the more exciting it is. So those are the men with the big erections and changing rooms who are, sort of posting on Twitter saying, oh, look how exciting it is. And those are the ones that we're trying to get out of women's spaces. But because everyone thinks they're all trans, they treat them as the transsexuals.
Okay, next question. Tracy, you've got a question for Az.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm wondering what the ethical argument is for putting so-called detransitioners who are trying to extricate themselves from this ideology into a group therapy setting with men who are enacting their fetish. Because my concern is that this situation still isn't being recognised as the safeguarding crisis that it is, and people are talking about how to balance the human rights of different groups, when in fact sex falsification undermines safeguarding because, as we know, sex and age are both key risk factors for both offending and then for risk assessment and safeguarding. And there are a lot of gender critical events now where we're seeing detransitioners being force teamed, in my view, with men who are claiming to be allies but are still engaging in their fetish, still have the female markers in their key documents, might say they're biological male but are still claiming to be a type of woman. And I also am aware of the high incidences of sadism and narcissism amongst some of these fetishists. We know it's co-occurring with other fetishes, and surely a group therapy setting is a chance for these men not just to coerce non-consenting participants, by which I mean even if they've consented to be in the group therapy, they're not able to consent to being part of someone's enactment of their fetish, but they could also be practicing their techniques with people who are trying to extricate themselves from the ideology that they were groomed into by these same people. So I'm just keen to hear what your thoughts were around the ethics of that. Has that changed? What you think about this type of forced teaming, as I would say.
Nobody was forced to be in the group. They're all voluntary. And what I inherited when I arrived was there was two clinicians who were retiring, and one happened to have a group of pre-operative transsexuals, and one happened to have a group of post-operative regretters. And the post-operative regressors, who may or may not have detransitioned, some of them were still living in the other gender role because they didn't want to detransition because they didn't wear it. They were all depressed, miserable, and really unhappy. And the pre-operative ones, which also had some transvestites who thought they were transsexuals, were all gender euphoric, and And I thought this was a strange division to have people based on whether they had their genitals or not. So I mixed them up intentionally, and it was so useful for the post-op. 26% of my patients were post-op regretters. They loved the group, and they said we wish we had this group before we'd done the transition, but they felt so that their what they were to get out of the group was different from what the other ones were. The other ones were to try and work out the gender. They'd already worked it out, but for them it was a healing process from a position of regret, and they found it really useful. They really found it useful. They stayed for years. So the thing about my group is there was no upper limit to time, and the post-operative ones stayed the longest. They found it really useful to be able to talk to the other ones who they could identify as what they were like before, but they also had this sense of healing and reparation by being in the group. So even though it doesn't sound like it might work, it worked really well. And the post-operative ones were the ones who really liked it.
Well, so I suppose my thoughts on that would be it's the same arguments with transition. There are loads of people who think that it was really helpful in the short term, and then they come to realize afterwards that it was abuse and they didn't recognize it as such at the time, medical abuse. So again, just when you said that it's group therapy and they're not looking to the expert therapist, they're giving therapy to
my role is to make sure everything's going smoothly and there's no abuse, there's nothing harassing, and so I'm not just sitting there silently. I'm there as the group analyst, and I have to make sure that it's a safe space and analytic space at all times.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the thing. Under the Sexual Offences Act 2003, it is
what I wouldn't suggest is you just have a group without a therapist.
No, of course.
So the role of the therapist to make sure it's a safe therapeutic space.
And that's my concern, really, because as I said, if these men, because we have men who call themselves autogynephiles or paraphilic transvestites openly, who are going about in their fetish gear. So if they are in a group with people who they may, as I said, they may volunteer to be there, but we know that coercive control is the major dynamic here.
But that would be an excellent opportunity for the group, including the conductor, to challenge exactly what do you think is going on here? Why are you turning up in this sort of? And that had happened, and people didn't realize they were doing it. I remember one point this man went from appearing as a middle-aged woman into coming as a man with really short shorts. And I said, you've gone from transvestite to non-vestite. Why are you showing somebody's flesh? What's that about? It was forcing him to be scrutinized within a group setting. So you don't just let things pass. If there's any inkling that anything is happening, then it's examined and critiqued by the whole group.
So I accept that that's your perception of it, but I'm saying that to me, that's not safe if we have somebody who, because you said in your group it was transvestites and detransitioners.
Why is it not safe?
Because you were saying that so your view is that AGP isn't the fetish, but transvestites are, and it's just you'd said earlier that you would have transsexuals, transvestites, and detransitioners in a group. So that means that there are people in their fetish in a group with people who are trying to extricate themselves from a cult that is being pushed, and often by men with fetishes. And we've heard especially young women who've been in groups like Benji talked about going to support groups where she was there with paraphilic men who were engaged in their fetish and being abusive to the young woman, telling them they couldn't speak about their dysphoria because it was upsetting to them. So it's the dynamics, of course, of control I'm concerned about.
What was the therapist doing at that point? What was the analyst doing at that point to allow that to happen?
Well, so that wasn't a therapy session. That was like a support group. So I would have expected in a therapy session, that's what I mean, that the groups.
But this isn't a support group. So this isn't a support group. This is an analytic group.
Yes.
Every frame by frame, every moment and every interaction is critically analysed by the group, including the group analyst. So
yes, I'm saying even the presence of these men, when we know they get often having an audience, then by that is encouraging their engagement of their fetish. And as I said, I'm also concerned that we know sadism is a hallmark.
But they wouldn't be having a by the fetish. They're not in a permanent state of arousal.
But I don't think you would need to be necessarily visibly aroused for it to be abusive, especially as a woman's point of view, because as people have raised, women are trying to escape being sexualized by men and then to be in a therapy. Well, were these sessions mixed sex or were they all male? And were they adult and minor or all adult or?
No, I only treat adults.
Adults, okay. So, but again, I just think that the coercive control aspect, and I don't mean you personally, but I mean in this gender critical discourse we have, there's too much downplaying of the sadism, of the coercive control, of the fact that there are key figures in the so-called gender critical side who have forced teamed themselves with detransitioners who are trying to bravely step away from the cult. Because I don't think that we would have someone who's an active drug user in a therapy group with someone who is trying to recover. We would bring in someone who has recovered to talk about and give that contrast you were talking about.
So for example, another group that a colleague did at the Portman, which you may think is controversial, was adults, a mixed group of adults who are victims and perpetrators of child sex abuse. And the reason for that is all the perpetrators were once victims.
Yeah, I would find that controversial because I just think the sadism thing then and the getting off.
So people did find it controversial, but that group actually worked really well as well. So on the surface, something might sound controversial, but every one of those perpetrators in that group was once a victim of child sex abuse. And so it wasn't too far-fetched to put them together. And for that therapist, it worked really well, and she's very famous and she wrote lots about it. But so sometimes on the surface, things may seem, oh, will this work? Well, all I can say clinically from doing it for, decades is it worked well. And there was no reason to anyone.
A last comment then would be, have you seen some of the detransitioners who are now, after years of saying of talking with the paraphilics or AGPs, whichever category you would be putting those in there, there's someone like, I can't remember who was it, Michelle Oliva. She's basically saying now she recognises that the abusive dynamic continued while she was being forced teamed with these gender critical fetishists while she's trying to get herself out of it.
When you say forced teamed, what do you mean by forced
time?
What do you mean by forced teamed? I don't know.
So because as allies. So basically we have, I'm not going to name names obviously in a recorded Zoom, but we have key figures who admit that they have that they are aroused by the idea of being the opposite sex. They accept that they are biologically not the opposite sex, but they're still going around, as I said, with female markers on key identity documents. They're still presenting in female clothing. And there are some detransitioners who, as they come out of the fog of the indoctrination that they've undergone for so long, it's the same as the physical thing. They might not recognize the harm of it for the first few years after an intervention, whether that's therapy or surgery. But as the brain fog clears, some of them are saying, I don't want to be taking part in events with these people. You know, they represent everything that I am trying to escape. So I just think it feels like we're moving into another phase of recognizing that these
everyone's
kinds of
different.
fetishes need to be handled separately.
Well, but I think everyone's different, and I know plenty of detransitioners that get a lot of support from the whole gender critical world and those events and everything. And half the book is chapters written by detransitioners, and they're very much part of the gender critical movement, and they get a lot of support from it.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying they shouldn't be part of the movement. I'm saying they're talking about actual events and things where they're
But they
like being
give you,
put on panels alongside men who are still enacting their fetish. But maybe it's just an agree to disagree, but it was helpful at least to hear
but
your
they're
thoughts.
adults, and if they feel that that's something that they want to do, then they can do it.
So we're domestic violence victims. So I think the coercive control aspect is mixed. Yeah, I'll leave that there though. Thanks very much for your responses.
Okay, next question is from Kathy Mudge, and Kathy says, you say as that they make a sequential mistake as a child that's never challenged, working in schools that are telling children as young as 5 to define themselves by what they play with. How can this be challenged with teachers?
Well, you just need to deprogram the teachers from all the stonewall teaching materials that they've swallowed wholeheartedly. I've got a dodgy police builder friend who he came to me saying what, his daughter was like really upset, and he went into a room and found this exercise book, and she's like 10, and her exercise book had scribbles saying I'm a wrong girl, I like football, and had a picture of her hanging herself. And she'd had some sort of gender cult like teaching session at school, and then her take home message was girls like this, and this. I don't like this, and this. I like football, therefore I should be boy. I'm wrong. That was her young person's understanding. And I've got friends whose friends' children were asked by the teacher, "Oh, you're a bit of a tomboy. Have you ever thought that you should be a boy?" It's like grooming, and this is based on some teaching like module they've had on Stonewall. So you just need to deprogram the teachers, and you know let them encourage children to do whatever they want to do. Doesn't mean that they're not a boy or a girl. The worst schools actually culprits are the private girls' schools because they're not under Ofsted. And I had a patient who's a mother of a girl who the school refused not to affirm as a boy, even though it was an all-girls school. And she said, well, if it's any consolation to me, at least my daughter's sitting next door in the classroom to someone who they're affirming as a cat on her left and someone they're affirming as a pterodactyl on the right. So
she could have taken the child out of that school then, couldn't she?
Yeah, but my first papers were asking the question, is the person who believes that they're the wrong sex, are they mad? It's a delusion. And then my subsequent papers, I said, well, no, they're not. It's that they're confused and probably autistic. We are mad because we're the ones who are responding to this in a mad way.
Okay. Unless you've got a follow-up, I'll move to Rachel, who's hosting tonight's session. You've got a question, I think, about self-referring.
Hello. Yeah, I was thinking that all of the kinds of trans people that you listed earlier were relatively benign and sympathetic. And I don't dispute that those people were as described, but I think there is another group who perhaps were missing, and maybe the fact that you deal with people that are self-referring, that they're the ones that are finding some kind of discomfort, that you don't see the ones who are very happy, thank you very much, with the way things are going, and are maybe some of the ones leading, encouraging trans belief in others, and the W path, the transgender person who is performing transgender surgeries, who is writing papers about eunuch gender. I think they're probably the ones that we have most to worry about. Have you ever come across anyone that you sort of describe by that?
Oh, absolutely. So you're right. So in my work in psychotherapy, my population sample was skewed because there were people who were interested in having an exploratory therapy. So that's a minute proportion of all the trans umbrella. But as a psychiatrist, and when I worked in forensic psychiatry, I've come across loads who wouldn't even want any therapy or any questioning. And when I worked in Broadmoor, I don't know what percentage it was, but let's say there was, I can't remember how many people on Broadmoor, 300. There was 6 there. I mean, the overrepresentation in high secure settings, whether I've worked in prisons, I've worked in high secure, medium secure, and low secure psychiatric settings. And there was an overrepresentation of trans people in those settings. So there is some association with offending and violence with trans. I'm not saying it's causative, but there's an association. Why would you have this overrepresentation? So, and then you've also got to factor in that gender isn't everything. Gender dysphoria isn't everything. You've also got to factor in other mental health problems and personality. So, there are people who have a gender. The mistake we make is that we think gender dysphoria, that's it. There's nothing else that can be happening with them. But no, there's gender dysphoria and there's whatever mental health illnesses they have alongside and the underlying personality. So you might have this psychopathic, personality of a person who is a transvestite who's very different from someone who isn't. So the personality type will determine their behavior along with their gender dysphoria and or any mental illness they're having at the time.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Amparo. Amparo's got a question for you, Az.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you very much for this session. It's very, very informative. And thank you, Dr. Hakeem, for the work he's done, because we've been listening from many voices, but he was just remembering everyone. And you, Alison, mentioned not doctors are not writing about this, and this was supposed to be something from the medical field. So because he's a doctor, has a psychiatrist, I'm very interested in asking him whether he knows about the change in the International Classification of Diseases about well, it was before it was called first gender identity disorder, then it was changed into gender dysphoria, and that was at the mental health section. But then that I think that was at the 10th edition of the ICD. But then for the 11th, which is the current one, it got renamed again from gender dysphoria to gender incongruence, and it was moved to a different section, which is a section of sexual health. So the trans activists talk all the time about the pathologization because it is no longer called dysphoria. They said it has been removed from the ICD. That's not true. It is a part of it is a diagnosis that could be
They've made it into a bodily disorder rather than a psychological disorder, which is ridiculous.
Exactly. But then because it is at the sexual section, how come they have added the child version for that? Because there's the gender incongruence for adults and gender incongruence for minors, and no one seems to be paying attention that it is the section for sexual health. How come children are being at the sexual health? So is this a gateway for normalizing sexual relationships for children? Because it's sexual health. And whether the original question was whether you know anything about how this change came to be. We understand, of course, it was pressure from the trans activists, but we don't know details. I mean, when, who, how that came to be. That's very informative.
When they're changing sections of the ICD-10, they invite experts in the field, and the only people that work in trans stuff are people who are captured, apart from me. And so, and I'm an isolated thing. I'm not work. If you're part of a clinic, you will be captured. So within the population of psychiatrists in the UK, the only people that are captured are the ones who work in gender clinics. So if you're looking to revise a section of the ICD-10, you ask the experts who work in the field, all of them who work in gender clinics, and they're all captured. So, you don't get people who don't work in it to advise on it because they say we don't know anything about it. So the only people who profess to know anything about it are the ones who work in the field who are captured. So they have a triumph of fantasy over reality in biology, and they say even though someone who's biologically a certain sex says they're unhappy and upset and emotionally distraught about being the other sex, it's not a mental health problem, which is, there's nothing wrong with their body. The problem is how they feel about it. By definition, it's a mental health problem. Yeah. So,
Okay, thank you very much. There was a question about that, and just a follow-up of a previous question, because you said that transsexual fetishists were not the same as AGP, but then I didn't understand what...
So there's transsexual, transvestite, and AGP. So transvestite get excited and or sexually excited. So there's a gradation between excited and sexually excited. So they get excited by wearing the clothes, whereas AGP is not about the clothes, it's about the genitals. So it's a man. So imagine a man masturbating furiously at the fantasy of having a vagina. It's the paradox. So their excitement is having breasts and a vagina.
And so if they transition and have medical...
So that's a disaster. So
yeah.
A proportion of the AGPs that I've seen came to me when it was too late. So if you think that if you're a man who is masturbating furiously at the idea of having a vagina and breasts, you go and see your GP. You don't really want to say, I've been masturbating furiously about the idea of having breasts and vagina. You say, I think I should be a woman. And then they go, okay, go to Charing Cross. There's a 2-year wait. And then they say, oh, we don't want to wait 2 years. Oh, I'll just get a plane to Bangkok. And I had literally this is the executive summary of what happened to these patients. I've seen a number of them. They got on a plane to Bangkok. They have a vagina fitted. And the first thing that happens if you have a physical surgical sex change is that you get castrated, you get an orchidectomy, or you get your balls chopped off. And we all know that your sexual libido comes from your testosterone if you're a man. And if you chop your balls off, you have no testosterone. And they all woke up going, I've got a vagina. So before the operation, they go, oh, well, I have a vagina, really excited. And then they woke up going, damn, I don't want a vagina now, because they had no sexual interest in it.
That's not funny. It's not funny. Okay, another question. Somebody's asked me to ask for them. Do you think that other psychiatrists, such as James Barrett from Charing Cross is mentioned, but must be others, or psychologists at other clinics, or indeed anyone who prescribes opposite sex hormones to those under 25, could be liable for criminal charges or even just medical negligence?
Obviously, I can't talk about specific individuals. That would be wholly
indeed.
But if we think about people who are doing interventions, it is questionable, isn't it? Because on the one hand, so that noise is my bulldog drinking water in the background, and he's very loud, and no one can hear him. Yes, I mean, I think it's medical negligence, but I mean, especially when children are involved, I think there's something much, much, much worse about doing things to children like that. And I tend to be in agreement with Elon Musk, who thinks it should be an imprisonable offence. With adults, it's difficult because you're giving people what they want. And whether if you have the capacity to make a bad decision, I don't know, so it's difficult. I think I'm very clear in what I think about children. With adults, not so sure. I know what I think is the case, but interestingly though, so the chemical castration agents and the hormones used, the pharmaceutical companies have never ever licensed them for that use. The reason why is, so if you prescribe these to children or adults, you're prescribing it off license. There is no license for drugs to be used, hormonal drugs to be used for gender reassignment. And it's very clever the drug companies have done that, because if there is, as we presume there will be, a massive load of lawsuits, the drug company's not liable because they haven't licensed for it. The doctors will be liable because they've used it off license. So the responsibility will come to the doctor and not the drug company, because the drug company hasn't said this is what they're used for. And so all these do-gooding GPs who are still giving children hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones because they believe that a trans child is whatever, against the CAS report, they are the ones who are going to be liable legally.
Are you happy with that question?
Me?
No, I'm just ask her. Are you happy with that reply? Just waiting to. Okay, I'll come back to that later if we've got any follow-ups. But that sounds like a good question. Hope is going to ask a question now. Over to you, Hope.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Hello.
Really, really, really interesting, especially the way you sort of divided up the categories of people and what the motivations are. My question relates to the workplace. So I work for an employer that has some years ago came up with a trans policy for our trans staff, and they very went down the model of self-ID and kind of affirmation. So somebody can turn up at work in the morning, announce that they've changed sex, and they'll be treated for all purposes as if they're the opposite sex, no kind of questions asked. I've been arguing with HR for some time that this is a belief, and they shouldn't be trying to force staff to go along with it. So, I'm all on board with treating my colleagues with respect, but I find it quite difficult that I'm being asked to participate in the belief in terms of being asked to accept.
But gender critical beliefs are a protected characteristic now, so you shouldn't have to be forced to go along with something that you're not.
So I'm not forced to go along with my belief, but I'm forced to accept the consequences. So I'm forced to accept, say, for instance, our women's changing rooms are nominally for women, but we have men using them because they say they feel that they're women, and obviously that's quite difficult for a lot of women. So I've been arguing that case for a long time, but I've also been starting to try and argue with them that this is a belief that some people have. It's not necessarily a helpful belief to them, and that by going the affirmation model, we're kind of encouraging them the path. We're a technical company, so we have a high rate of not just people who say it, but diagnosed autistics.
Yeah.
So it's a real prevalent thing. It's not unusually high in the company. So I do worry that we have a lot of people who are quite kind of vulnerable to it inherently, and we're sort of encouraging it in a way. And of the people I've spoken to, that they're quite reluctant to talk to people like me. They're quite scared. The ones I've talked to, I have the sense they're quite fragile and quite vulnerable.
And the employers are usually the employers are usually trying to do what they think is a good thing, but they're being a bit reductionist and simplistic, and then interfering with the rights of other people who don't want to go along with this nonsense. I mean, I had a regretter who went back years later to the family, their workplace, which of course was a public sector, very affirming one, and friends, and said, "Why on earth did you not ask me what on earth I was doing? Why did you just go along with me?" And they said, "Because we're being supportive. That's what we thought we were doing." And their whole public sector workforce were just going along, so there was no reality orientation for them. And then I had another patient who was a part-time transvestite, and he knew that he didn't want to have a sex change because he was a man, but he liked dressing up as a woman 2 days a week, and so he could get a blood probably. But he said, "I've come out to my employer as trans." I was going, "Why?" He said, "Oh, because I quite like to go to work dressed as a woman twice a week." I said, "But why?" He said, "Well, they've got this policy and I can, so it's quite nice." And I said, "But this is ridiculous because they probably think that you're en route to having a sex change and they're trying to sort of be supportive and accommodate you, but actually you're not. You're just doing something that excites you." And I said, it's a bit like if you said you're a nudist. would you go to work 2 days a week naked? Would they let you fulfill that excitement? Of course you wouldn't. So because the employer is trying to be nice, they think all trans people want to have a sex change. They're trying to be nice to them. Whereas actually they just open the door to all these fetishists to be able to live their fetish in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions how I might talk them round to at least considering this as a possibility? And
give them a copy of my book.
Yeah, time to read your book.
Good idea. Okay, thanks for that question, Hope. Now I've got two questions that people have asked me to ask you. One is, can you ask, what would be the best approach to take when your son is captured in the ideology and believes he's a girl? Another person asks, how is it better to book the consultation and treatment with you? Is it a long waiting list? The consultation is for my 19-year-old son.
So I don't see gender people. I do see their parents though. So it's too technically difficult to do gender now. So I've done enough of that, but I'm happy to see parents as the patient rather than the gender person. In terms of what was the first question? The first question was
what would be the best approach to take when your son is captured and believes he's a girl? How should this mother respond?
If you go back to the idea that if you don't agree with me, you hate me. So you've got to bear that in mind. So it's a bit of a tightrope. So what you don't want to do is just affirm them. But what you want to try and avoid doing is getting into this, yes, you are, no, you're not, yes, I am thing, because that's what it'll be. So my suggestion is to adopt a neutral, inquisitive, inquiring approach where they experience you as wanting to try and understand. So the position is, gosh, this is a surprise. I can't get my head around it, but I'd like to. Can you try and help me understand how you got there? And so you get them to try and educate you as to how they got there. And hopefully by doing that, you see how they got there mentally. And there'll be chinks in their process, a bit like me with my maths A-level homework. So by doing that, it's if they experience you as a neutral, supportive parent who wants to understand, that's a useful intermediary position to be in. As soon as you go into a no, you're not in my house, it might work, but then it might risk them just leaving you and divorcing you, which a lot of them do. So it's very difficult. But do not affirm, be inquisitive and want to try and understand and question.
Okay, and the same was true of Anne and her daughter. So I hope, Anne, if you can put something in the chat, if that looks like the answer to your question as well.
And again, now, just asking why and how and oh really, but doesn't that mean that sort of way?
In fact, as I was speaking to Stella O'Malley and recently, and she has published a book with a couple of colleagues about what happens when your kids present. I'm thinking for these parents just coming across this.
Yeah, and also, so read Stella's book, but also if you have got a child in that situation, then hopefully you've already joined the Bayswater group or Our Duty, because they're really useful resources.
Okay. Now then, Mary says she still doesn't quite get the difference between the various different types of people who present as trans. How would you categorize Eddie Izzard? Obviously, this is
So I've never met him, so I can't say for definite. But Eddie Izzard always used to say that he was a transvestite and not a woman. But now that transvestites are all part of trans, then that's amorphous. So just to recap, the three main categories are transsexuals, where you believe that you should be the opposite sex bodily. The transvestite doesn't believe that. They get excited by impersonating the opposite sex, whilst they know that they're not the opposite sex. And the autogynephile is sexually turned on by the idea of having vagina and breasts, or the autoandrophile is a woman who gets excited by the idea of having a penis. So one is about believing in the wrong sex. One is the titillation of naughtily going in the clothes of the opposite sex. And one is very rare, which is the sexual excitement about having specific body parts.
Right. Okay, thanks for that question. I've got another question from a parent.
I can make it more complicated. I could talk about the 11 different types of transvestites, if you want.
Actually, I think you covered that in your first book, Trans, didn't you? And also in the first chapter of this book. So I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from reading your book. And you at the end, you've got lots of links to various groups. And I think Bayswater and Our Duty are really good support areas. Now, here's a parent asking, my daughter had no signs of gender distress until she hit puberty. In 21, she was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and wanted me to change her name and pronouns. Her school and her father affirmed her new identity, but I couldn't call her he, him, and she left home. So I hasn't seen this daughter for 3 years. She's now 17. And I keep thinking maybe I should have played along. How can I get her to accept the reality when I have no contact with her anymore?
I mean, how can you answer that? I don't know. It's difficult, but that's exactly what you join Bayswater and Our Duty for, because there'll be other parents in the same situation. Because there isn't a right or wrong. There's no right or wrong in how to parent a child who's presenting with a gender confusion. You just got to play it by ear and work out what the right thing to say at that time, which is going to be heard rather than run away from or shout it down. There's no one is an expert. It's just literally trying to, walk a tightrope and play it by ear.
Okay, I've got a question actually, because our maybe I shouldn't be asking this. Our manifesto was published today, and there's several items in there which we don't think are helpful. Let's put it that way. One of the promises is to ban all forms of conversion therapies and practices. Do you think that this would be a real threat to exploratory therapy?
So it's difficult because I did think it was, and Lloyd Russell was the MP who was all for the conversion therapy bill, and I said, look, it's really important you come and talk to me. And bless him, he did. He came to my house and sat in my living room for 3 hours whilst I talked to him. And what he tried to say was a conversion therapy is one where only one solution is offered rather than a number of solutions. So he said, I don't know how much to believe him or not, he said an exploratory therapy isn't offering a solution, it's exploring. So he said it wouldn't be, even though everyone out there, all the trans activists, thinks it is conversion therapy. He said that a gender identity clinic which only offers affirmation would fall under conversion therapy, because you're literally converting someone, not offering exploratory therapy, not offering any other option apart from that. So I don't know whether he was just saying what he wanted me to hear, saying what I wanted to hear, sorry, or not. So, I mean, the real conversion therapy is affirmation, that and converting someone into another bodily version of themselves, and affirming that is conversion therapy. It's transing the gay away. You're converting a gay person. We know that out of gender confused children, if you left them to their own devices, most of them would end up as non-gender confused gay people. So that's what we know. So by affirming them and changing their sex, you're basically converting them into heterosexuals. And when I was at the gender identity service, the child one, GIDS at Tavistock, I said to the person who set it up, who seems to have avoided all scrutiny now, I said, look, all these kids that you're bringing in, these boys, they're just camp boys. They're just going to end up being gay men. Why isn't what you're doing mad? And he said, is it any less mad than if they were to be gay? And this was the Tavistock, which is steeped in institutional homophobia. The Tavistock clinic, who would not let anyone trained to be a psychotherapist if they were homosexual, because they had not navigated through their Oedipus complex. And I had to sit through 2 terms in my first year on the pathology of homosexuality in lectures in the adult department. They never appointed a consultant if they were gay. They were very clear that homosexuality was an inversion, which is similar to a perversion, and pathological. So the idea of saving children from being homosexual by transing them into a heterosexual was thought as a good outcome by this clinic.
Crikey. Crikey. I got that impression from Hannah Barnes's book, which was very thorough the way she dealt with. And a lot of the psychologists were saying this is transing away the game. It's clear that that was very troubling.
They thought homosexuality was a defense against psychosis.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. Why do you think that nobody else has set up a joint group therapy service for post and or pre-operative?
It was such a useful intervention. But bearing in mind, I ran this for over a decade in a clinic which turned a blind eye to me doing it. Nobody was interested. I'd give presentations and colleagues would be going, disgusting work. And they'd be happy listening to therapy things about paedophiles, rapists, and shit fetishists. But as soon as you talk about gender, they squirmed. They didn't want to hear about it. I was one of the first whistleblowers or tempted whistleblowers of the Tavistock. And I remember going to the medical director at the time, Matthew Patrick, and saying how the concerns I had about GIDS, and he may as well have put his hands over his ears. He just smiled there smugly and didn't do anything. That was in 2004, I think. So there's been a blind eye to the work. I mean, I don't know. And also, most people are too scared to do the work. So the therapists who do the work tend to be affirming counsellors. Psychoanalytic psychotherapists just work individually, and group analysts, I don't know. I don't know why nobody's doing it. It works really well, and less than 2% of my patients went on to have any surgical interventions because they didn't want them. They were fine.
You should be speaking to somebody from the Times or the Observer, who would write this up and make something of it, because
I've done the Mail. The Daily Mail have done a couple of things.
Have they? Right. But I think the Sonia Soda or Janice Turner or Hadley Freeman, they'd give you a really good write-up.
Oh, well, link me up, and I'm always happy to do these things. So just make the instruction. I'll do it.
Easier said than done. Now, Sue England, you've got a question. I think this is probably going to be the last real one, I'm afraid, because we're getting, we're going to be out of time in a bit. Over to you, Sue.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to be cunning now and try and introduce two things. But the first is just information, although I could say, has anybody experienced this? Remember, if somebody comes and tells your work, I've transed, if they've got a new name, you can just shut it all down by saying, oh, yes, well, show us the deed poll and what's the date? And we can all do deed polls. You have to then tell everyone. You have to tell the taxman, the doctor, the insurance company, change the deeds in your house, everything like that. Just shut them down by that. We are British citizens. We have a very lax, very permissive attitude towards deed polls, but you change on a particular day. You have to tell everyone, and it becomes your new legal name, and then everybody has to use it. I will obviously use the legal name of a colleague of mine, or if I'm entering into it, I'm involved with them as any organization. So start using that technique. Say, oh, fine, show me your deed poll, because HR, the tax people, the national insurance, the health and safety, they've all got to have your new legal name. Okay, and we'll send every letter out to you that way, etc. So that's my tip as a lawyer. We must start using that. Because they're just abusing people's sort of, gullibility and hospitality. So my question is, you've mentioned, Dr. Hakeem, you've mentioned that, well, for example, we've got to deprogram the teachers. It sounds as if we've got to deprogram a lot of people. So this looks like a great career opportunity, which we should be, in getting people trained, and it's going to provide an awful lot of work, isn't it? So how do you get trained as somebody who deprograms people? What's the qualification?
I think anybody with a sensible head who's done the groundwork and done the background. You don't have to be, you're not doing therapy for people. You're just talking to people and allowing them to return to the common sense they had before. Because you're trying to get them to accept science and reality, which they did in the first place before they got captured. So it's allowing them the permission to think how they really think, and go along with this new think and new speak that they feel that they have to go along with.
But how can you don't want to be paid, so how can this become a qualification, and how can we begin to get it
I think,
funded so people
but
can do
the
this?
same way that you have, those people in organisations who are the diversity people. I mean, how do they hit rise? You could a similar role would just be the reality orientating person who just allows people to get back with reality, because everyone actually, it doesn't take long in just a conversation for them to realize that what you're saying is common sense. It's just allowing them to. I don't know how you do that. I don't know who would do that. I don't know.
Companies pay for that, you see. So how do you persuade a company to say you need a deprogrammer on your staff and we can refer people to it?
But do you need a
I'm
deprogrammer,
being practical.
but do you need a deprogrammer, or do you just need to stop them from doing all the stuff that captures people?
If they're doing it in their work, in their school, officially, like approved by everybody, you've got to have something like official to put against it, haven't you?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm just a mere doctor. I don't know.
Okay, I'm just proposing the question. Maybe we can start thinking about it.
I think it would have
Deprogram.
to. I think it would probably have to take a governmental decree that this was to be done in schools and local authorities and civil service sessions. And I don't think, I'm suspicious that that isn't going to happen. One final question is about the informed consent model that some adult clinics use. That is, I say if I want it, so I should have it and not be questioned. Do you know about this? And if so, can you talk about this, please? Is this not ethically irresponsible within medicine as it's not science-based? What's your opinion?
Well, I need to see what the process was, but to be able to give informed consent, you've got to have mental capacity, which shows that you understand the options put forward, and you understand the pros and cons of intervention versus not intervention, and that you can weigh those up and communicate your decision. So, for example, I don't believe a child can have mental capacity to make these decisions about gender. Absolutely no way. An adult, well, they may have the mental capacity to make a decision that's a bad decision. That doesn't mean we have to go along with it. Those people that apocryphilia, partial, they believe in their partial bodied people in whole bodies, who they have the mental capacity to say chop off my leg, but medically it's not good practice, because you're doing harm rather than doing good, and it's first do no harm. So hopefully, well, there are people who do that, but so just because someone has the capacity to consent to something doesn't mean we have to do it.
And in fact, for public policy purposes, we don't want to do this, do we? Because it impacts on the rest of society.
And
okay.
Yeah.
A few final comments. Let's see. Jane, you had a quick question about pharmacological tests. Can you run through that?
Dr. Hakeem, would it be possible to run some tests with men who are taking estrogen to get some quantitative results for the emotional changes that happen in their in their emotional life as a result of taking estrogen?
Why would you want to do that?
Well, to prove that there are not just physical but also emotional changes.
But what would be the aim?
Because this has never been done to my knowledge.
But why would you want to show that estrogen causes a certain degree of emotional change versus less estrogen?
Because the physical changes are so dire. For example, a man...
Wouldn't you be buying into the idea that, oh, I'm emotional, therefore I'm a woman? Because look, women have... there's a double-edged sword. If you get some man saying, oh, look, women have more estrogen, which makes them more emotional, I'm more emotional, therefore I should be... It could be counterproductive.
All right, I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, look, I think there's been a really great discussion and some fabulous questions and answers. And I think that there's obviously a big issue about safeguarding, certainly for youngsters, but also for vulnerable young adults as well. And I don't think we must forget about that at all. And I think the work that you have been doing, I think will be has been groundbreaking. And I'm really quite sorry that you're not doing it anymore with these.
It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous.
Yeah. But you are prepared to see parents of the youngsters.
Yeah. Parents, organizations, institutions, teaching. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just when you're seeing patients, you're letting yourself be opened for the vilest of attacks and attempts to ruin your career, ruin your life. Yeah. It's not worth it.
We see this all the time, don't we? Yeah. But I would like to say thank you so much for coming along and talking to us and answering the people's questions who've obviously saved them up.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that's really great. Thank you again for coming for a second time. Knowing what happens to you. The book is brilliant. This book
and
also Trans. Both of these are well worth reading. I can promise you. And I'd like to thank Rachel for managing the event for Liberal Voice Women. We're hoping that we'll be able to put the talk up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. Thank you all for your questions and comments. It's been really good. We'll next meet on Monday, the 8th of July, and then I'll be talking to Dr. Kim Thomas, who wrote the report for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on birth trauma. Do look out for the announcement or sign up to our website. Our website is liberalvoicewomen.org, and we'll send you the invitation as soon as it comes out. And we also want to hear from you with any policy-related issues or problems that you want us to raise. Thank you all. Thanks, Az. And I hope to see most of you again next month.
So much.